I'm delighted to be here. A bit similar to Ger and Alex, I feel like a bit of an interloper in the sense that the research that I've been doing hasn't really started from a health and well-being perspective, but it's been an emergent theme in the research that I've been doing. And I'm going to refer today specifically to work called Share City, which is looking at food sharing in cities, and particularly food sharing mediated by information and communication technologies. And sharing between non-familial groups, so beyond friends and family, beyond the kind of celebratory feasts that we might still do around Christmas and things like that, and to look at these stranger sharing phenomenon that's really emerged perhaps since 2008 and the accessibility of ICT in particular. I kind of shifted around the title of my talk to reflect that in the sense of food sharing really is the focus, and the health, well-being and sustainability aspects kind of emerged from that. So why food sharing? Well, I'm delighted to say that the foundations of the Share City project really came from EPA-funded research, which took place probably 5 years ago now, but there are some reports at the back of the room if you're interested in more detail about the Consensus project, which really involved a multi-stakeholder participatory visioning about sustainable consumption in 2050. And one of those was sustainable eating. And we deliberately looked at sustainable eating as a social practice rather than sustainable food as a kind of abstract commodity that we might look at. And one of the workshops which looked at generated 3 different scenarios which had differential levels of regulatory, social, and technological change. You don't need to, I don't even know if you can see the detail, but what those red circles illustrate is where there were imagined collective enterprises which took place as part of this sustainable future. So the stakeholders that were involved, which were futurists, academic, practitioners, policymakers, they all envisaged that a more collective food future was something that would be more sustainable. And this really stuck in my head, and I want to say, well, is it really more sustainable? What do we know about food sharing and collective action around food currently? And what impact is it having? So that really led me to Share City. And I explored first the theories that we already know about food sharing. There's a long and distinguished history among anthropologists, ethnographers around food sharing, but the predominant bunch of research is really on foraging societies, hunter-gatherer societies, small-scale subsistence societies, not the contemporary Western liberal democracies that I live in and which Share City's research was focused on. So while some of the issues there are still familiar and probably relevant to sharing today, things like securing sustenance, ensuring status within a society, but also sometimes showing off in terms of like the assets that you can share with others, it really struck me that perhaps there were some other drivers and norms around what was happening with food sharing today. So in order to do that, we looked at how food sharing is defined. And we're all probably familiar with that notion of sharing as caring, which we all try and teach our kids when they're younger, this kind of very pro-social, altruistic behaviour. But if we look at the dictionary definition, it's much more than that. And actually, it doesn't necessarily exclude forms of exchange which involve financial arrangements. And certainly we were interested not just in food sharing in terms of eating together, but across the food spectrum, from growing right through to redistribution, and in this case, at the bottom image, community composting. So this was really where we started with the definition. And then we were able to map, because we focused specifically on information and communication technologies, all the food sharing initiatives that we looked at had some element of a public presence. So we were able to map, and initially we did more than 4,000 of these across 100 cities worldwide, and we categorized them. So we were able to analyze what they did, what they claimed about the benefits that they did, and what were the motivations and drivers behind their activities. This is an interactive website, so you can go onto our website, sharecity.ie, and actually play around and search by different cities, search by different forms of sharing, whether it's bartering, gifting, selling, forms of different types of modes of sharing. But what we did we drilled down into a selection of 9 cities across the world. A number of European cities of contrasting context, so we looked at post-austerity Athens, Dublin, Berlin, Barcelona, London. We also looked at Melbourne, Singapore, and New York. as different settings within which, and we found these kinds of activities everywhere, across the full spectrum. So this was it's the first time that this has really been mapped, because often these activities are really small scale and they fly under the radar of public policy visibility and even definitely public vision. So we looked in 9 cities at 4 initiatives in each, and we really drilled down into these 36 initiatives. And what we found was that 95% of them claim environmental benefits and social benefits. Only 68% of them are claiming economic benefits, which we took to be saving money or being able to sell things for money. Interestingly, though, 50% of them also claimed health benefits. And this wasn't something that we initially sort of set out to explore, but we certainly felt that it emerged from the mission statements. And this food cloud, word cloud here that you can see, illustrates the common words that came up in the mission statements of these food sharing initiatives. I'm going to illustrate to you now how some of the interviews and participant observation that we did with initiatives really articulate some of these themes about food sharing, drivers and motivations that touch bases with issues of health and well-being. There were many more issues that came up, but I'm going to focus on that today. So look at this case here. Skip Garden Kitchen is based in London in the King's Cross development. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it's a massive development on the old King's Cross rail site. And this Skip Garden is part of an initiative called Global Generation, which seeks to connect people with each other and with the planet. And what they developed was a mobile garden. So these skips, literally the skip garden at the bottom, allowed people to move around in these very precarious land tenure situations and to actually engage with a whole bunch of activities that related to connecting people. And actually Global Generation have this tagline which really struck a note with me, and it's called "We take the I, we, planet approach." So they're concerned about the individual within communities, but then also the communities within the environment. And I think this shapes all of their activities. But the quotes here from the founders just illustrate some of the important health and well-being claims that they're making. So they're talking here about explicitly the mental health benefits of working together in a collective endeavour, and the fact that labour that goes into that can create physical benefits as well. And this was something that was reiterated across a number of different initiatives. So here we have Skip Garden again, but also Edible Garden City, which is a community farm based in Singapore. We have Himmelbeet, which is a community garden in the Wedding district of Berlin. And all of these reiterate this kind of notion of connection, whether it's across cultures, connection to land, connection to others, and even connection to others with different abilities. So it's about paying attention, in the words of Himmelbeet. It's about being respectful to each other, to yourself, and to the environment. So all of these sort of illustrate the benefits that these initiatives were seeking to achieve. Here again around connections, and this is where they explicitly talk about the I, we, planet approach, sort of making friends. And we know, I'm sure there's many more sort of clinical professionals here who will know better than I, that already the notion of loneliness increasing mortality risk is a major concern for health providers. And matters of coming together around food provide multiple opportunities for people to engage at different levels. And what we found amongst the participants when we did studies there was that actually people didn't have to be fully engaged. They didn't have to be there every day. And actually people often wanted quiet spaces to work alongside others, not necessarily having intimate, strong ties with each other, but just having that ability to work towards a collective endeavour was extremely powerful. Also, fundamentally, there was a lot of learning involved in all of these initiatives. Here's the first quote here is from Organisation Earth, which is a community garden, but much more than that, based in Athens. They were providing a safe space, if you like, for people who experienced extreme austerity measures within Athens at the time. And they talked about this environmental and social intelligence. They were very keen on empowering and providing capacities for people to enable them to engage fully in society as citizens, but also to contribute towards positive change within those locations. So as Skip Garden Kitchen said, these places are not just sort of classrooms. They're more than that. They're experiential spaces. And we know in terms of educational research that it's much more effective if people can learn by doing than simply be given facts and figures. And this was something that was at the heart of many of these initiatives that we explored. Very interesting last case here from Himmelbeet, which was the Tummel Book Project. And this was a gardening book for everyone. Himmelbeet is an inclusive, multicultural garden, so they welcome anyone of any ability into their environs. And the Tummel book was co-designed, so literally everybody worked together to ensure that the content of the book was accessible to everybody. And this is something that was not easy, as they mentioned in the quote here. It created some conflicts and discussions, but ultimately it generated a resource that was very important to their initiative. So fundamentally, what we found, sort of an emergent theme, was that food sharing really does seem to hit a number of ways to well-being which have been identified in previous initiatives. So I'm sure you're all familiar with the Ways to Wellbeing framework, which was established by the New Economics Foundation back in 2008, but has been rolled out in different iterations subsequently, particularly in the NHS in the UK. And I could say, even from the examples that I've illustrated just today, that they hit every single one of those ways to well-being. And I was looking for evaluative research of the Ways to Wellbeing projects recently, and I struggled to find many, but what one did say was that there was a problem in this initiative in terms of establishing new interventions around Ways to Wellbeing. And my response was, well, we already have lots of places where these activities are already existing examples of spaces where Ways to Wellbeing can be enacted. So the question was, why aren't there more of them? If increasingly we see health providers socially prescribing collective activities as creating mobility or creating a barrier or creating a means to overcome loneliness, why don't we have an infrastructure of these things which are supported? Not only that, these initiatives are very frequently grassroots, community-led, volunteer-run for the most part. They often have very precarious existence. And this is just some screenshots here of examples where these kinds of initiatives struggle to survive themselves. They struggle to sustain their very activities, even while sustainability is their very driver. So we thought within the Scarcity Project, let's look at the challenges here. What are they? Why do they come about? And we trawled the vast empirical data that we had created and identified a suite of challenges. And then we held a workshop with practitioners, with policy shapers and academics to really explore what the challenges are. And we did this across the board, from cooking and eating, redistributing food, as well as growing together. So I'm just illustrating this with this slide, focusing specifically on the challenges that growing initiatives encountered. And fundamentally, there were three common experiences across all these different settings, and that was about gaining access to land, gaining security of tenure to land to grow together, being able to communicate with policymakers the benefits that are generated, and then influencing policy decisions to ensure that those benefits are recognised and acknowledged in strategic planning initiatives. What we found through the international workshop was that some people had some really good ideas about how we might do that. There were some cases in certain places where these barriers, while commonly experienced, had been overcome by different strategies. And this slide just illustrates some of those. So the first one with regard to securing land tenure. There were examples, say, in New York, where what had happened was an initiative called 596 Acres had really advocated on behalf of community gardens to enshrine those community gardens as public parks, because public parks are protected underneath the decision-making plans within New York City. So the idea is it gave them some security moving forward. Other cases were changes in rules from Oslo, for example, where they actually changed the rules of planning to allow these kind of meanwhile places, places waiting to be developed, which had been developed for growing, could actually demonstrate the benefits that they had created. They also suggested that actually it's up to us, it's up to people to champion these initiatives and to make sure that the impact is visible. We also tried to take them outside of their comfort zone and say, okay, some of these issues that you're mentioning are intractable, so how do we go about dealing with them? And these were just some examples that were generated in terms of this hypothetical newspaper article to get them to think about how you might communicate a different way of doing things. And one of the suggestions was that Dublin creates a Metropolitan Food Council, which allows these kinds of activities a voice at the table of planning with other stakeholders. And I think that's a very interesting idea. Finally, they suggested that academics need to do more about establishing metrics for these things and, amongst other next steps forward. And as academics, we're always happy to oblige. So we were lucky that at the same time we were in parallel to this workshop, we were developing an online interactive tool, which we're trialling now with our co-design partners and will be launched in January 2020, to provide a platform for food sharing initiatives to demonstrate their sustainability benefits. It has 3 different components. The first is the tool shed, and this includes, as you'll see on the slide here, some indicators which seek to capture the health and well-being benefits that food sharing initiatives generate. But in addition to that, we're also providing spaces where these initiatives can share stories about what they do. So often it's very much about the experience of participants that's important, and it's not always easy to capture the benefits in terms of quantitative measures in the traditional sustainability impact assessment framework. And that's the talent garden. So we're hoping that initiatives will showcase what they do. And finally, the greenhouse, which we say is like a Tinder for food sharing initiatives, to try and matchmake, to cross-fertilise ideas between these different activities, to enable them to share challenges, to share responses, and ultimately create a more dynamic and hopefully supportive platform to really articulate the benefits that they create. So finally, in conclusion, what we have found is that food sharing initiatives really do cultivate conditions for change. And I think that that's a really important part about empowering people to take care of themselves, to take care of others and the environment around them. And we really extrapolate some of those ideas through a conversation article which was published a couple of weeks ago, which you can check on theconversation.com. Searching for that title. For a sustainable future, we need to reconnect with what we're eating and each other. And I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.